on the first day of the week. We meet on Sunday instead of Sabbath. That changed at the resurrection of Christ. And so Easter is celebrated every time we get together as we think about worship. Why? Because it is the life of Christ that gives us hope. It is the life of Christ that gives us life. It is the power of Christ that gives us that hope of glory. And so I greet you this morning in the name of our risen Lord and our risen Savior, the one who loved us, the one who gave himself for us, the one who came that we might experience life, that we might experience it abundantly. It is Mother's Day this morning, and we greet all the mothers, and we greet all of you sisters this morning in a special way. We are looking at Anna this morning out of the Christmas story, or the account of Jesus as a little baby. We're looking at her as someone who is faithful. And each of us this morning needs to understand what faith is and needs to have faith placed and rooted deeply in our life, in our service, and in our prayers. The 3 points this morning that we see in this woman, Anna, and the 3 points that each of us need in our own lives. Each faithful sister this morning and brother this morning needs to have an understanding of what it is to be faithful in our life. So we'll endeavor to take a few minutes to look at this woman this morning and to honor her and to honor each of you as sisters this morning in the Lord here. And to look at Anna, the prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. I'd like to go back this morning. I'd like to start with the tribe of Asher and go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 31 and take a few minutes just to go back and bring to our attention this morning. I'm sorry, 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles, not 1 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verses 1 through 11, talk about Hezekiah as he sends out to all Israel and Judah letters to Ephraim and Manasseh that they should come to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem to keep the Passover of the Lord of Israel. He's calling them back to keeping and observing the Passover because the king had taken counsel and the princes of the congregation of Jerusalem to keep the Passover in the second month, for they could not keep it at that time because the priests had not sanctified themselves sufficiently, neither had the people gathered themselves together to Jerusalem. The thing pleased the king and all the congregation. And it goes down through here, down to verse 10. So the posts passed from city to city through the countries of Ephraim and Manasseh, even to Zebulun, but they laughed them to scorn, and they mocked them. They were making fun of them. They laughed about it. They said, we don't need to go back to Jerusalem. We don't need to observe the Passover back there. And they mocked them to scorn. But, I love the but in the Bible. You know, it gives us that hope. So verse 11, nevertheless, different families of Asher, of Manasseh, of Zebulun, humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. All right, so the beautiful part of this sad picture is the reality that there were some who returned. And here is a descendant of one of the faithful remnant that returned to keeping the Passover in Jerusalem and observing the law and observing the command of God and coming back to remembering the Passover and what it stood for and what it meant and the deliverance that came because of God's intervening for his people and delivering them and reminding them that someday it wouldn't just be remembering Egypt, but someday he would send his Messiah. Someday he would send his Son, who would come as a great deliverer, and that they would remember this. Here is the descendant of one of these faithful people. Is it any wonder that Anna finds herself in a place where she represents faithfulness? You see, beloved, yes, each of us has to make those choices for ourselves. But oh, beloved, this morning, that we would root and that we would set our anchor deep in faith. That those who come behind us find us faithful. Those who come behind us are looking forward and recognizing that the faithfulness of those behind them is something that set an example. And maybe it wasn't your parents who set that example of faithfulness. And maybe you don't come from a lineage of a family that was faithful. But that doesn't mean that you and I can't be faithful and represent faithfulness to those after us. Maybe they're not our offspring, our children, but we still represent faithfulness. It's something very important. So I wanted to start by showing us the importance of faithfulness. Here were some who were faithful, in spite of the fact that the rest of their tribes didn't care and laughed at the truth and laughed at the idea of going back to Jerusalem. There were those that were faithful. Beloved, it's important that our faith is real. It's important that our faith is represented in the way we live our lives. It's important that we are looking at and observing the truth of God. We are incorporating that into our life, into our service, and yes, into our very life of prayer. That our life would be a living life, a living prayer before God. Somehow, it's easy for me to separate those few minutes of prayer or that short period or window of prayer from the rest of my life if I'm not careful. But our life needs to be a living prayer and testimony of God. Do we see it that way? Sometimes we do, sometimes we fail to. But let's remember that as we view our life as a living testimony or a living prayer to God, it changes the way we act, changes the way we react. It changes the way we respond. It changes how I respond when somebody cuts me off in traffic. It changes how I respond when a gal swats me with her dirty tail. It changes the way I respond when something irritates me in life. Why? Because my life is a life of faithfulness, not only in faith, in life, in service, but also a faithfulness in prayer to God. Anna here is a woman who represents God. She is faithful in her life. Anna, a prophetess, she was of a great age and lived with her husband 7 years from her marriage. She was a widow of 84 years. Now, I guess it depends how you interpret this. Some scholars say that she was 84 years old. Others would put her up to maybe even over 100, depending on how you interpret this. The point isn't how old she was. The point was she was at an older age, and she didn't let her age stop her or stop the flickering flame of faith in her life, but she continued to worship God. She continued going to the house of God. She continued steadfast in her prayer. She continued steadfast in her testimony. She continued steadfast in her faith. She continued living and working within her life in a way that she, it calls her here a prophetess. In 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, it talks about how that she was a prophet before God. See if I can find this as I wrote it down here. I can't see it there. I'm sorry. How she, as a prophet, was called to edify. First Corinthians. There it is. I knew I wrote it down somewhere. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 3. Follow after charity, verse 1, and desire spiritual gifts, but rather that ye may prophesy. For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue speaketh not unto men, but unto God. For no man understandeth him. Howbeit in the Spirit he receiveth mysteries. But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men for three things. Number one, for edification, for exhortation, and for comfort. Edifying, speaking of the message of God. Here is Anna. She is one who is prophesying before God, in that she is speaking of the message of God. She is speaking to those in Israel who were remembering and who were looking for the coming of the Messiah, for the one who would come to redeem Israel. She is prophesying to those around her, and it may have been, I read from one of the scholars who said, she may have gone door to door in Israel, door to door through the towns of Israel, prophesying before them of the Redeemer and the redemption who would come. Secondly, the prophet, in 1 Corinthians 14, he was to edify and to exhort. He is to build others up in their faith. So here is a faithful individual who came from the lineage of those who chose to be faithful, the lineage of those who chose to go back to Jerusalem to worship God, and she is going from place to place. As she is living her life, as she is faithful in her life, she is testifying of the Redeemer who would come, the redemption that would come, the one who would come to redeem Israel unto God and unto himself. A life of faithfulness was a life that Anna lived. The life that we live today needs to be a life of faithfulness. A life of believing the truths of God. So firstly, it was edification. Secondly, it was exhortation. And thirdly, is comfort. What a beautiful reality of a life of faith. And that is, beloved, this morning, let us not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season we will reap if we faint not. Let us remember that as God's people today, he calls us to a life of comforting those around us. Don't worry about the pandemic, because God is in control. Comfort those around you. Don't become weary in your life of faith. Don't become weary in a life of being a servant before God, but comfort those around you. Go from place to place, and as you're living your life, know and understand and realize that God is calling you to a life of comfort. He is calling you to prophesy of your faith to those around you, and to do it in a way that your life of service would be a life of comforting those around you. The hurting, the sorrowful, the sad, the downhearted, those that are sick, those that are in need. These are all areas in which our life of service brings us to the place of understanding that it is imperative that our life is rooted and grounded in the faith of Jesus Christ. And we see this through the faithfulness of this godly woman, Anna. She is living a life of faithfulness, and she is called a prophetess. The prophet, the one who was exhorting, the one who was speaking, was to do so in edification, in exhortation, and in comfort. Beloved, that we would live that life of faithfulness today, that life that would draw others to the realization that our life is a life that concentrates on the Messiah, on the Redeemer, on the one who is coming to give us Easter. the one who was coming to give us hope, the one who was coming to bring us to the understanding that there was a comforter who was to come. She was speaking to all who were looking for redemption in Jerusalem, in verse 38. Were all looking? Was everyone looking? Well, let's just go back a few verses. The shepherds saw him, and they ran through the town, proclaiming to all what had happened. Did everybody see it? Did everyone see? Was everyone looking? Well, we aren't. It's not recorded, is it? That anyone else went. However, I say Anna was one of the faithful ones who was calling others to look for the redemption in Israel, to look for the redemption of Jerusalem, to look for the redemption of God's people. I say, beloved, this morning, it is important that we understand that as we're calling out to others, that we are to call them remembering we are called to a life of faith. And that life of faith will bring us to the place where we have an undiminished flame for God. She could be blaming whatever. She could be blaming life and the hardships of life. 7 years she's married to her husband. It doesn't tell us everything of her story, but could have she stayed there and wallowed in the pity? I'm sure she went through a time of sorrow, and that is right. But she didn't stay there. She overcame the sorrow. Praise God. A life of faithfulness will do that for us. She doesn't stay in the hardships of life. Neither does she hide behind her age, but she goes forward in faithfulness, saying, I want to serve those around me, and I want to call them to understand that the Messiah is coming. Beloved, a life of faithfulness will call us to the place where we call others and we shine the spotlight for the Redeemer. One of the frustrations of my job at home is when I get animals that get out. Some time ago, not this year, but before, I had a group of young heifers. They would have been 300-400 pound size. So they were big enough that you couldn't manhandle them. But there were 6 or 8 of them together. And all you need is 1 or 2 goofy ones. And they can ruin a whole group of them. All right? Well, that's what I had. And it got to the point where they didn't honor anything. I mean, they go straight through any fence anywhere, right? Well, it got to the point it was so bad, I never wanted to leave them out. So one evening, I brought them out of the barnyard into the barn, and one of them bumped into the one gate that I had there and spooked. I mean, she went goofy. I mean, she just went ballistic, and she went out of the barnyard. And as she did it, she got caught in the one gate. I couldn't stop her, and she has this thing hanging on, and she just took off, and all of them went with her. All right. Well, it's dark. All right, I should have had it in before it was dark. She went goofy, all right? And she was gone. So I spent the next hour, and I called my brother, I called my nephews, and I called the neighbors, and I went here, and I went there, and I was shining the spotlight, okay? And I was spotting up and down my lane and back and forth and in and out and going up and down the road. I didn't want them out overnight because if you get on the road, then I'm liable, and so I'm worried about this. And I'm shining the spotlight. And I actually went over to the neighbors and I said, do you mind if we drive up your field lane to the mountain? And so we were going on the neighbors on both sides. Well, they were up in the mountain running. I don't even know where all they went, but we found them the next morning over at the neighbor farm up behind. Point was, I was shining my spotlight out here looking for what was happening because it was dark out there. My question is, was scheduled to, that was a Saturday evening at that, right? And I was all by myself. It was before I was married, and it was a weekend when I had all the work to do myself. My parents were away. I had no help with me. And so I got up an hour and a half, 2 hours earlier, and I called my nephew and I said, hey, will you come up and help me? Because I was scheduled to do a Sunday school class first thing Sunday morning over in the town of Howard. So I had to get all the work done, and I find these heifers, and I had to get them all back in, and I had to be prepared. And I went to bed exhausted, but I didn't sleep that night. I didn't rest that night. Here's the point. My spotlight was shining. It was shining through the darkness. Beloved, what are you shining your spotlight? So what about my animals? All right, they all got back the next day. But my point is, a life of faithfulness shines the spotlight in the darkest of days, in the darkest of hours, in the darkest of the night. We shine our spotlight on the fact that there is one who is coming not only to redeem Israel, but to redeem all mankind to himself. He has come that all men might be saved and that they might know him. Ellen, thank you so much. In your prayer this morning, you prayed that Jesus Christ would be known and that we would know him as the only way to heaven. Thank you for that, because it ties in with that life of faithfulness, doesn't it? It's that life of faithfulness. And as we continue to shine our spotlight on Jesus Christ, and not only Jesus Christ crucified, but Jesus Christ, the risen Savior, who came as your Redeemer and my Redeemer, calling us to himself and commissioning us to go forth in a life of faithfulness, a life of service, and a life of living prayer before him. This was Anna. She shone her spotlight continually to those who were looking for redemption in Jerusalem. And what happens? Remember what just happened before this? Simeon is there, and he is blessing this child. Simeon is blessing Mary and Joseph and the child. And behold, this child is set for the fall and rising again of many in Israel, and for a sign which shall be spoken against. Yea, a sword will also pierce thine own soul, that the thoughts of many hearts may be revealed. This is Simeon speaking, right? And he's holding Jesus. He's holding this baby infant, this incarnated Christ. He is holding him in his arms. He sees this. He is blessing God. And as he is doing this, Anna steps into the picture. You can almost see and hear Simeon as he's singing or chanting a chant of triumph. And you can almost hear Anna coming in the background and joining in with him. Now, it doesn't say all of that here, but Simeon is here, and as he is holding him, Anna, coming in at that instant, gave thanks also. So Simeon is giving thanks to God, and you can see Anna, that faithful woman, coming in beside them or behind them or around them, giving thanks also to God. Why? Because the Redeemer finally is here. He finally has sent his Redeemer to come. She departed not from the temple. The hours of prayer were at 9 a.m. We see that in Acts chapter 2. We see as Acts chapter 2, verse 15. Peter and John are standing there, and they're sharing that the Spirit comes upon them on the day of Pentecost, remember? And the people were saying, this is early in the morning, you must be drunken. And Peter says, no, they are not drunken as you suppose, seeing that it is but the third hour of the day. This was an hour of prayer, 9 a.m. And then in Acts chapter 3, verse 1. Now Peter and John went up together into the temple at the hour of prayer, being the 9th hour, or 3 p.m., the hours of prayer. And during the hours of prayer, Anna was there. She was praying constantly. She was constantly looking as that life of service and that life of prayer. She is not departing from the temple, that she would be there praying and sharing. If you go back to Luke 18, Luke 18, verse 2, verse 12. Remember what's happening here? This is where the publican and the Pharisee are praying. Remember? Jesus gives this parable. He spake this parable of two men that go up to the temple to pray. One is a Pharisee, and he's saying, God, I do this and I do that, and I fast twice a week, right? That was what was expected. They're very pious of people who had to fast twice every week. And he's saying, I do all that, and I go and I do this and I do that. Why? So that I can appease myself. And I'm not like this sinner over here, but the sinner is the one. Isn't that amazing? That went away blessed by God. I'm tying that all in with our key verse. Our key verse for the morning out of Proverbs. We see the virtuous woman in chapter 31. That is where we get our call to worship. Favor is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord will be praised. It goes down through and it explains what she looks like. Let me just go through it real fast here. What is this woman in Proverbs 31? She is a wife, a mother, a manufacturer, an importer, a manager, a realtor, a farmer, a seamstress, an upholsterer, a merchant. She lives in strength and in dignity. Her appearance is never mentioned, but her dignity continues to be based upon how she looks, but what she does. And what she does represents her character. I'd like to ask anybody here today, male or female, how many of you can carry that many times as she does? The point isn't how well you measure up to the 31st chapter of Proverbs. The question is, are you faithful? Do your best. Are you living a life that understands what it is to be faithful in all that you do? Faithful in service, faithful in prayer. Not focusing on me. But here, this virtuous woman, it says that her focus is to do this to honor her husband or to honor those around her. It doesn't say that she gets the credit for it, does it? But she, in living that life of faithfulness, is living a life that represents a life of service and favor and love for her God, realizing that it's not about me, but it's all about Him. It's not about what I can do or what I have done or what my accomplishments are, but it's about understanding that as we unite ourselves together and as we honor our authority, we're honoring God for His glory and for His happiness. May we, as Anna live a life of faithfulness in all that we do. She gave glory for the redemption of Israel, and she brought them around her, those around her, to a place where they saw Christ because of her light shining on changing a little bit the way we close our service here. So let's do